Okay, so of course, Atkinson and Shiffrin's model is not the only model around, and part of that is because there are some pretty strong arguments against the modal model. One is the evidence for interference. Remember, Atkinson and Shiffrin said that you lose information from short-term memory because of decay, and they specifically said not because of interference. It turns out that there's a lot of evidence that forgetting is not solely due to decay, that interference does play a role, that if you shift your eyes, that the new information that's coming in through your eyes will disrupt your short-term memory of the things that you had been looking at. Or if you just shift your focus mentally, like you didn't have to really move your eyes, but you just start to think about something else, it clears out your short-term memory store. The evidence for coding, Atkinson, this gets a little bit into the weeds, and I don't really want to, bog you down with too many, there are really specific nuanced arguments that Atkinson and Shiffrin made about how coding must occur in short-term memory, and then it is placed into long-term memory already coded. Like short-term memory, that's what it does. Well, it turns out that coding probably happens in short-term memory and also in long-term memory. That it's not that once something is in long-term memory, it never gets updated, it never gets connected to new things. That's just not true. So they were unaware of that, and the model was presented, and then people started finding out, through attempts to falsify the model and stuff, that no, in fact, coding happens in long-term memory, and the strategies look very similar to what happens in short-term memory. And then the evidence from the amnesiacs, especially the anterograde amnesiacs, it turns out that information can be transferred into long-term memory. It just turns out that it's what we call procedural memory. People with anterograde amnesia are oftentimes unable to declare what's in their long-term memory, but it is actually there. And so that's a potential still support for short-term memory in the sense that, well, it's in my long-term, but I can't pull it out and declare it. But I can show you that I know it. For example, HM, he was going golfing with a memory researcher named Daniel Schachter. And every time they would go out to the golf course, he'd be like, wow, I'm so excited to golf. I've never golfed before. And every single time he'd say that, even though they'd been dozens of times together. Oh, I've never golfed before. This is going to be so fun. And he did not know the rules. He could not state what the rules were. Anything that required what we call declarative memory, he couldn't really do. But he showed evidence of procedural memory. Like his golf swing got better. His putting ability got better, things like that, like his procedural memory, his actual, like physical memory, anything that could be done without having to be aware of it, that looked normal. It was the kind of memory that required him to actually say out loud or voluntarily produce the information that was hindered by his damage to his hippocampus. So, as I started finding some chinks in the modal memory model, Baddeley and Hitch came along and offered a new interpretation of what was going on with short-term memory, and they coined the term working memory. Some of the characteristics of working memory, well, whereas short-term memory has been very specifically quantified to be between 7 plus or minus 2 individual items, working memory is a little less clear in its capacity. All Baddeley and Hitch could say for sure is that it's limited, but to what specifically, we're not sure. Those are undefined limits. The duration of the working memory, well, they say that it deals with transient information, the kinds of information that kind of comes and goes and might be changeable. Where did you park today? Or what was the temperature yesterday? What did you have for dinner last night? It's kind of one of those working memory things. It's transient. It's unimportant in the long run. And in fact, might be maladaptive if you remembered every single one, right? Like if you remembered every single place you have ever parked whenever you've gone to school or some other place with big parking lots where you may not get the same spot every time, maybe your apartment complex, something like that. Can you imagine if you remembered every single parking spot with equal emphasis? So today, when you're going out to find your car, every single one of those parking spots is equally calling to you. How maladaptive would that be? It's already bad enough, isn't it? I don't know about you guys, but I have sometimes been like, where did I park? I've done it at the grocery store. You know, if you go to the same grocery store enough and you've spent an hour in there, you come outside and you're like, is this time or is this another time that I was here? Where did I park? You get a little confusion, right? That kind of transient material is best if you can just substitute the new information, isn't it? So you don't have to search through all of the other instances. Now, how long is transient? Well, different people have argued vastly different amounts of time. 48 hours, 28 days, maybe even longer if it continues to be relevant for the moment. That not very specific. Long story short, we're not exactly sure. But think about the kinds of information that they're talking about. You can kind of see why maybe the duration would vary depending on what's going on, right? Like think about the last time you stayed at a hotel. I'm trying to remember the last time I went anywhere. I'm recording this in August of 2021, so okay, it was February 2020 was the last time I went somewhere and stayed somewhere. Okay, I remember what city it is. Off to a good start. All right. I can remember the hotel. Don't remember what floor. I know I took the elevator. Right? I can piece together some aspects of it, but could I tell you that I stayed in a specific room? Absolutely not. Definitely, I do not remember the room number. While we stayed there, we charged things to the room, stuff like that. So I knew my room number then, and I needed to know it. You know how those cards that they give you now, they don't even have the room number on them. And so you have to remember what room you're in. So yeah, you know your number while you're there, and then you leave, and it's like, it's to your advantage that it's not permanently stored in your memory, because think of all the hotel rooms that you've ever stayed. Same thing with a parking space, right? Think about where you parked 3 weeks ago or something. And why would you need to know that? I simplify my life by trying as much as I can to park in the same spot, even if that means having a less advantageous spot, but it's always the same one. Like I will always park here, then I will not walk around looking like the absent-minded professor who can't find her parking spot. But I mean, think about it. You might get that same spot this quarter, and then next quarter, other people's schedules have shifted, or your schedule has shifted, and now that spot's not available, so you got to learn a new one. So for like an entire quarter, 12 weeks maybe, you remembered that spot as part of your working memory, but now that you have a new spot, you need to not have that old one interfering. So now you have new transient material called where I'm parking now, right? I used to be a waitress. Anybody who was a waitress might be able to relate to this story. Once a party has left the table, you kind of clear everything that you had been remembering about that party so that you can address the next party of guests, right? So while that party is there, you know who's having the Coke and who's having the root beer, let's say, or at least I did. I always, as a waitress, I didn't write things down. I didn't ask people a lot of things. Like I tried to remember, right? So if I had somebody who had Coke and somebody who had root beer, I'd try to have some kind of mnemonic device for that. And I that way I could refill them without having to ask them and stuff. And who had decaf and who had regular. Of course, one mnemonic for that is they put like a little coaster under the decaf people or whatever. But once that party would leave, I'd approach a new party at that same table. Can you imagine how interfering it would be if I'm like, okay, well, you have the Coke and you have the root beer. And they're like, no, I don't. Well, yeah, you're sitting in the Coke and the root beer spaces, so you're getting them, right? Can you imagine? That'd be really maladaptive. So luckily, we have this ability to sort of replace the existing information with the new current relevant transient information. All right, so we have imprecise capacity and we have imprecise duration. Okay. Now we're going to start getting a little bit more specific though. Baddeley and Hitch argued that there are subsystems to our working memory. So we have the visuospatial sketchpad, which should sound pretty familiar because remember Brooks was talking about visual spatial processing, right? This is talking about the visuospatial sketchpad, and here they've got an image of a maze illustrating what's going on there. This side of your working memory handles all the visual information as well as your position in space and those kinds of cues and information. The phonological loop includes anything that they've got an ear here. It doesn't have to come in directly through your ear, but it has to be some kind of verbal sound based. It could be music, kind of information. The reason why, even if you read information, we consider it part of the phonological loop is because when you read, there's a part of your brain that translates the written words into a voice. You've heard that voice in your head while you're reading. It's your voice. And it's reading aloud to you, basically, because the area of your brain that processes incoming speech has to have it be speech. And so it has to hear it. So this little part of your brain, and we're going to get into the areas and I'll name them for you in another chapter, but this little area of your brain's job is to say out loud, basically, inside your head, the words that you're reading. So that's why it's considered phonological loop. Phono means sound. So it's this loop of anything that is produced by sound. Now, what's kind of neat about Badley and Hitch's model is that it says, the visuospatial sketchpad and the phonological loop can work simultaneously. So you can be processing for meaning, cat and dog, you can be processing those for meaning at the same time as you're orienting yourself in space or whatever, processing, how light it is outside or whatever it is, right? Like you can be doing these things simultaneously. It's when you have competition in what they call the same modality. So if you have two things that should be processed in the phonological loop going on in the environment, that's what's going to interfere with processing. But if it's one task is visuospatial and the other one's phonological, you can actually do those simultaneously. Now, governing how you're processing all this information is this really super vague entity called the central executive. Like, they were never really clear on what the central executive was. One hypothesis is that it's some little homunculus that lives inside your head, a little perfectly formed human that's in there pulling switches and levers and like that. That's probably not what the central executive is, but they didn't define it very well, so we don't really know what is the central executive, what makes those decisions. How does attention get applied? So not really clear. So, but we know that according to their model, they think that it deploys your cognitive resources and decides what to pay attention to, and it directs your high-level cognitions. And then I put my little sarcastic homunculus there. Like, what are you talking about? Is there a little wizard inside of our heads controlling all the flow of information? Probably not. So what do you mean? And they really have never in what's this been 40 years, really defined it. So some arguments against the working memory model. One is what I have, I think, made very clear as I've been presenting this, is that it's unclear. It's vague, it's imprecise in its definitions. It's not really a memory model. It's more of an attention model, isn't it? It's got the central executive deciding what you're going to pay attention to, right? It sounds a lot more like attention than memory. And then it kind of ignores the value of semantic processing, right? It really doesn't take into account encoding based on meaning. It seems to take into account based on sound or based on appearance or spatial orientation, and not as much based on meaning. And that's sort of a shortcoming, especially in modern models of memory. A lot of emphasis is placed on semanticity, like the meaning of things. And so I think what's starting to happen in the modern literature is that the working memory model is being looked at as just sort of a short-term memory with a little bit more intention and a little bit more duration. And so a lot of modern researchers are using the term working memory when they're meaning more than what Badley and Hitch really defined back in 1974. I think they're meaning kind of a combination of the best parts of the short-term memory store that Atkinson and Shiffrin described, and then the working memory model that Baddeley and Hitch described. They're like putting it together and saying, okay, it's like whatever you're paying attention to right now, and calling that your immediate memory. And well, they're calling it working memory. So I think there's a lot of imprecise use of the term working memory. You guys have probably heard the term working memory used, and things I'm saying are probably surprising you because you're like, I thought that was just short-term memory. And they really aren't technically synonymous. So hopefully you can see that now that we've discussed both of the models. All right, we're going to take a break here because now we're going to get into my favorite model. So bias alert, and we'll talk about the levels of processing model.